If you've been checking in on this channel for any length of time, you'll probably know that I spent most of the second half of 2021 exploring just how bad the New South Wales government's pandemic response had been. Bad really is an understatement. It was a shocker. It started with hubris.
And we made sure that we had the systems in place to be able to weather whatever came our way so that we would never go into lockdown again.
Then moved toward half-assed measures and ended up putting half the country in lockdown. When the Dom took over, he really kicked things up a notch, driving a stake through the heart of the national plan, earning him a hashtag.
Who made that? Who came up with that nickname? Who came up with that nickname? You.
And opening up to widespread infection on a scale not seen in Australia to that point. Enabled by the media and the federal government, New South Wales was marketed as the gold standard.
New South Wales is the gold standard.
I'm very proud every time the Prime Minister regards New South Wales as the gold standard.
By contrast, throughout the first 18 months of the pandemic, Victoria was promoted as the lockdown state. In general, the Victorian public had embraced the response, outside what a vocal minority, egged on by the media, may like to think. Opinion polling would bear this out, with Daniel Andrews' popularity throughout 2020 and 2021 riding high. His decision to run daily press conferences and front up for 120 consecutive days was a big win for his image. The often marathon press conferences, streamed live, gave many members of the public their first real insight into the media machine. It also gave a glaring insight into what the Victorian Premier was up against. The rabid press pack often came across as unreasonable and antagonistic, giving Daniel Andrews the opportunity to stand up as a calm voice of reason. He was seen as standing alone, and that worked for him, with the majority of the Victorian public getting behind him. It really became an us against them kind of thing. Throughout the first 18 months of the pandemic, the Victorian government stepped up to provide leadership, filling the void created by an absent federal government. So why have I taken this trip down memory lane? To provide context for what's to come. For the first 2 years of the pandemic, Victorians saw what leadership could look like. Every day we got stuff like this.
Leadership is not about doing what's popular, it's about doing what's right.
Now, when the situation is arguably worse than it's ever been, we're getting this. Put bluntly, leadership in Victoria has gone missing. Now that's going to be difficult for some people to hear, and I fully expect to cop some hate for this one.
Haters gonna hate.
There are those people that will support Daniel Andrews no matter what he says or does. This video is probably not for them. There are also those that hate the man with a passion and will disagree with him no matter what. This video is probably not for them either. Then there are those people that sit somewhere in the middle. The people that might be thinking that, generally, the Victorian government did a decent job in the first 18 months of the pandemic, all things considered. The people that might think the constant sniping from the federal government and the media was for the most part unfair and unwarranted. Those people that may currently be feeling abandoned. The people that might be thinking that 2022 is the year the Victorian government dropped the pandemic ball. If you feel those things, it's okay.
You are not alone.
This video is for you. For all that we went through in 2020 and 2021, I expected a better standard of leadership this year.
I'm not mad. Just disappointed.
From a public health perspective, 2022 has been the worst year of the pandemic in Australia. And once again, Victoria is out in front for all the wrong reasons. There was a time where we had a Premier who would make solemn daily announcements marking the deaths of Victorians.
I'm very sad to have to inform you that a further death has occurred.
Right now though, Victoria is averaging around 120 COVID deaths per week, or roughly enough people to fill a 737. And all we have is silence. Can you imagine a 737 crashing each week? Well, that's where Victoria's at right now, and acknowledgement of that fact is scarce. Case numbers are no doubt underreported on a grand scale. The hospital system is buckling, and it has been for a while, with no real public health measures in place to minimise the impact of COVID on the health system. Where previously the Premier would plead on a daily basis for people to do everything they could to limit the spread and ease the pressure on healthcare workers.
Wear a mask. It's not too much to ask.
Now he can't even bring himself to mention the M word. That's masks. I meant masks. When the ambulance system hits code red, the blame is placed on COVID, and not even that can bring about a sensible discussion on mitigation.
Had another code red overnight, I think it's the 5th for the year. Danny Hill from the Ambulance Union said there is literally no way you would say there is a safe amount of resources. Is the government failing Victorians?
Look, we put $12 billion in at the last state budget. We've recruited 2,000 paramedics. Another 700 are in the pipeline due to the last budget. We've always got to do more, but we are asking Victorians to be on the journey with us. We are going through a difficult time with influenza, the winter months, COVID. It is a difficult time. Make sure you've had your flu shot, be triple vaxxed, do everything you can to have a healthy lifestyle, an outdoor lifestyle, because we know it is a very difficult time for everyone. We've got to support one another, but we've all got to do our bit as members of the community. We've all got to do our bit to ensure we're triple vaxxed. We only use 000 for those emergencies, and then we ensure that we can support our paramedics, our healthcare professionals, and it is a difficult time. We are in a difficult period of the flu season. I've had my triple vax, I've had my flu shot, but we're still, doing everything we can to be healthy. And it's incumbent on all Victorians to do everything they can to have an outdoor lifestyle, be triple vaxxed, have your flu shot. We know it's a difficult period. We will get through this like we got through the pandemic.
Even if you're over COVID and would prefer to ignore it, you really can't ignore the fact that now is not a great time to be needing emergency healthcare.
Fresh evidence pressure is again mounting on the health system as hospitals battle a surge in winter illness.
The education sector is suffering. Kids are sick, teachers are sick, as well as sick of being taken for granted. And remote learning is still a thing. Not because of lockdown, but just because of necessity. The reality is there are not enough healthy teachers to teach. All those issues aside, what will the long-term health impacts of allowing the population to be infected not just once but on multiple occasions be? So where exactly did things go wrong? I'd suggest it can be traced back to the unholy union of the Dom and the Dan. I'll let the Dom explain.
So it was very clear to me early on when I became Premier, particularly when Omicron started, was that the relationship with Dan Andrews, for me, was going to be a particularly important one. I get criticised for being the open up guy. He gets criticised for being the lock it down guy. So if we could somehow work together and have similar settings in place, the ability for the media to criticise and instill fear in the community based on the approaches we were taking, we would take that off the table. So it was a strategic plan for both of us to mirror our settings where possible. That has proven to be incredibly successful.
So has this new era of collaboration been born out of a desire to set aside partisanship? Or is it a marriage of self-interest and convenience? Based on this from Dominic Perrottet, I'm leading towards self-interest and convenience myself. I mean, it is hard to argue with the strategy. It's tied both traditional and social media up in knots. You can't criticise one without criticising the other.
But where Dan and I reached that agreement was if we could come out on the same day with the same settings, whilst he would get attacked for not going far enough and I'd get attacked for going way too far, we could work with each other to say, well, go look at Victoria, and he could say, go look at what Dom's doing in New South Wales. And it worked perfectly.
So while it may have been successful politically, it's come at the cost of public health. For the icing on the cake, here's the New South Wales Premier gleefully revealing how his government misled the public in order to restore public confidence.
Air quotes.
It was the most ironic one I thought was, we ended up bringing QR codes back when we weren't even tracking and tracing. There was no science behind it at all. It had zero utility. But there was a massive campaign, and when those massive campaigns get run, what it does, it depletes confidence. So we actually brought it back for one reason only, to instill confidence so that people would go out with using QR codes.
Sure, you can say Daniel Andrews is busy announcing free rats for schools for the rest of the year, but that's never really been about public health. Again, I'll allow the Dom to explain.
I think that relationship, particularly with schools going back, where we reached agreement on schools. I mean, when we announced schools going back, the media would rush to find the scariest epidemiologist who was out there saying every child across New South Wales would die. And that was a problem because we had to instill confidence. So what did we do together? We agreed that we'd go and get all these rapid antigen tests, which was a massive feat. I mean, we procured millions of these tests and had the plan together where we distributed them before school started to 3,000 schools across our state and 5,000 childcare and early childhood education centres. And by doing that together and having that plan, and here's another interesting thing about the pandemic, health completely disagreed with this approach, by the way. They didn't see the point of having surveillance testing, but education wanted it because we needed to once again instill confidence in our teachers and instill confidence in our parents that children would be safe at school. And New South Wales and Victoria, once again, a Liberal state and a Labor state, having exactly the same policy in the main, really built that confidence in. So when those reports came in, those concerns came in to parents, that there was that sense that, well, if it's good enough for New South Wales and it's good enough for Victoria, I have greater confidence in the approach. And what have we seen since then? I think one of the most important successes over this period of time, because we both agreed, Dan and I, that it wasn't just about educational outcomes for our kids. Getting kids back in the classroom on day one brought back normalcy to life here in our state, well, here in New South Wales and in Victoria as we move through this phase of the pandemic. And so I think that approach of collaboration, sharing of information, testing of ideas has been incredibly important, and I want to continue to foster that as we move through the next stages and beyond.
In passing the pandemic legislation, Victoria now has even more in common with New South Wales, with both states now effectively in a position where the chief health officers can be easily sidelined. You just know the next couple of months are looking rough when even New South Wales Health are coming out with this.
Wear your mask.
We have to create an enabled environment to say that actually wearing a mask is an okay thing to do. And it's reasonable to do it now. We are going to see a wave. Your risk of coming down with COVID is going to be significant in the next weeks to months. So isn't it worthwhile a simple measure of having a mask? It's a simple step. I know that it's a very polarising debate, masks. And I suppose I find that a little bit hard to understand when it's such a simple measure that people can take just at this time.
The Victorian Chief Health Officer had appeared to be on the brink of a similar push in early June.
Brett Sutton, the Chief Health Officer, can only give advice if asked. Written advice if asked. That's right. Okay. That's right. And there's no guarantee anybody has asked his view on masks. The Premier won't answer the question, the Health Minister hasn't either. Brett Sutton, if he believes in masks, and I'm told a lot of people in the Health Department do, should be on his hind legs shouting about it because it's a public health issue. But under this legislation, he has to, and the government won't ask him because they don't want to do it because it reminds people of Dictator Dan. You know, I've been desperate to talk to the Chief Health Officer, Brett Sutton. I mean, let's face it, he was a bloke out there all through the really dark days of the pandemic, and he's disappeared now under the new legislation. Epidemiologist and infectious diseases expert says we've got to get the mask back out there. These figures are horrendous, and the Health Department says he's unavailable. I understand he's busy. No question there. We will fit in. I'll pre-record him. I'll do anything. But he is unavailable. He is unavailable. He is unavailable and has been for months. Brett Sutton probably can't talk without government approval. Well, the Premier just gave approval. We'll have another go, but don't hold your breath. I have a deep suspicion the state government is putting politics ahead of public health. Professor Sutton has now advised Victorians to wear masks indoors. Now, that's a step further than the government has been willing to do, but he has done that publicly. The Chief Health Officer believes masks should be worn indoors. I don't think he's going to mandate them for a moment. I think it's a matter of advice. I reckon it makes sense. But is that the health advice to Daniel Andrews? Just like wearing masks indoors. He's likening flu vaccination, which everybody recommends, to wearing masks indoors voluntarily. So the state government doesn't seem willing to go that far. Is that what Daniel Andrews endorses? Does Daniel Andrews advise people to wear masks indoors?
Right before he went on a month's leave, and further protections were rolled back in his absence. Now, I'll respond to some feedback I received the last time that I dared to suggest that the Victorian government had gone MIA. Do you really expect Andrews to go it alone? Since ScoMo's gone, you've lost both relevance and the plot. I'll address the question first. The short answer is yes, I do. I expect politicians to do the right thing, not just when it's politically convenient. Let's face it, he was more than happy to go it alone early on when it was doing wonders for his polling, wasn't he? To that point, I'd be quite curious to see the results of the lockdown polling. Unfortunately, we never will, as it's been classified as cabinet in confidence. What has come out, though, via FOI has been heavily redacted. Both facts are interesting in themselves and don't reflect the level of transparency I'd like to see from governments. To the second point, I lost relevance when Gladys resigned.
Good morning, everybody. Please no, please no, please no, please no.
What good would things like mask mandates do when we already have people ignoring them on public transport? I guess I'd start by saying we know that a large percentage of the population will ignore anything that's remotely inconvenient, especially when they know they can get away with it. Lack of compliance is a function of lack of enforcement. And how can mask mandates on public transport be enforced if the government cannot even bring themselves to utter the M word? Secondly, the messaging coming out from the government is so weak at the moment, you can't really blame the general public for thinking it's all over.
We will get through this like we got through the pandemic.
The message that's been actively promoted for the last few months has been that the pandemic is over. Personal responsibility is ineffective when the story you've been selling for months is that we're all back to normal and the pandemic's behind us. We've reached that point where the public health response of our government is being driven by popular opinion, not by health experts. It's a shame they won't employ that same model for other stuff like taxes. Pretty sure paying tax isn't popular with the punters. Like it or not, the Greens were right. The Victorian government has been sleepwalking toward a health crisis. So why has the Andrews government refused to act this year? While they may try to deny it, the most obvious answer is
election year. Election year?
This is an election year.
Look, I'm sure that's not the only reason, but we would be kidding ourselves if we didn't have it toward the top of the list. With the opposition courting the freedom crowd, the state government would not be keen to stir up Sky and the Cookers again, for fear of losing ground. The Victorian opposition, though, is an absolute basket case, and realistically they're unable to offer voters a viable alternative. No doubt Labor will romp at home come election time, but through their inaction there'll be plenty of Victorians who won't be around to see it. So what are my words of wisdom for the Victorian government? Do better.
Leadership is not about doing what's popular, it's about doing what's right.
I so desperately want this to be over that I'm going to pretend that it is.
Under the Act, I'm required to seek advice from the Chief Health Officer. I'm also obligated to consult more broadly with business and community leaders and indeed with my colleagues. The Chief Health Officer has provided his advice and I have accepted his advice, except that I have chosen not to extend mandates for mask wearing in some of the settings that were recommended to me by the Chief Health Officer. The advice from the Chief Health Officer was to mandate mask wearing in early childhood and school settings, and indeed in retail and in some hospitality settings for workers in those areas. Now, I have had the opportunity to consult with industry leaders. What our business leaders know and what they experienced last January was that if they don't take actions, they will lose their staff to COVID. So what we saw in January was businesses were closed because their staff were home with COVID. I have assurances from business and community leaders that they will work actively to encourage mask usage, but also the other things that we know can have a real impact.
We're screwed, aren't we?